What happens when a child from a silent Amish community witnesses something no human mind was meant to see? Why did an entire valley choose to erase one night from its history? And what secret sleeps beneath the barn that was struck by red lightning and then vanished without a trace? This is the story of the silent witness, the Amish child who saw the unthinkable in the barn, a story buried in faith, silence, and something far older than both. If the silence unsettled you, imagine what's still buried beneath it. Follow the channel for more untold stories that were never meant to surface. There are places in Pennsylvania where the map fades into whispers, where the land itself seems to forget it was ever meant to be shared. Nickel Valley is one of them, a place untouched by the hum of electricity, the rattle of engines, or the noise of the modern world. Its air carries the faint scent of wood smoke, wet soil, and something else, something no one speaks of, though everyone breathes. The Amish of Nickel Valley live by rules written long before their birth and obeyed long after their death. Work from sunrise to sunset. Speak only what is necessary. Keep the world outside where it belongs. In that silence, there is peace, or something that resembles it, but even silence can rot, given enough time. It began, as such things often do, with a feeling. The animals grew restless that spring. Horses balked at their reins, chickens refused to roost, dogs whimpered at empty corners of the barns. The men blamed a coming storm, the women blamed the men's superstition. Yet each night, when the lamps were blown out, the sound returned, a faint rhythm beneath the earth, not thunder, not wind, a heartbeat. The Lapp family lived near the edge of the valley, where the forest pressed too close to the fields. Their home was small, their life quiet, their faith unshaken. Amos Lapp, a man of few words, believed all fears could be silenced with work. His wife, Ruth, believed prayer could heal anything that dared to enter their walls. And their daughter, Miriam, only 7, believed everything her parents told her, until the night she stopped believing in anything at all. Before that night, she had been a child of sunlight and chores, her laughter echoing through the fields. But lately, she had grown withdrawn. She spoke to corners of the room where no one stood. She avoided the barn at dusk. When her mother asked why, Miriam only said, "It listens." No one questioned her further. In Nickel Valley, children often spoke strangely. They said innocence could hear what faith could not. As spring deepened, a strange heaviness settled over the land. The air thickened, as though the valley itself were holding its breath. The crops sprouted unevenly, their roots curling toward the surface as if seeking escape. The elders met and murmured that God was testing them. But behind their eyes flickered another thought, one older than their scripture, older than the valley's name. At night, when the candles burned low, Amos heard something moving inside the barn. Not the shuffling of livestock, not the sigh of wood. It was slower, deliberate, as if something large but careful were shifting through the hay. He told himself it was the wind, but the wind doesn't breathe. The following morning, Miriam refused to eat. Her eyes were glassy, fixed on the window where the barn stood dark against the horizon. "It's awake," she whispered. Her mother pressed a hand to her forehead and found no fever, yet her skin was cold as stone. By evening, clouds gathered above the valley, heavy and red as bruises. The silence grew deeper. Even the crickets stopped their endless song. In the distance, thunder rolled, but it was a hollow sound, wrong somehow, like something imitating a storm rather than being one. That night, as the Lapp family knelt for prayer, a tremor ran through the floorboards. The oil lamp flickered once, then steadied. Amos rose, muttering that he would check the barn before the rain came. Miriam clutched his sleeve and shook her head. "Don't go," she whispered. "It wants you to see it." He went anyway, and in that moment, Nickel Valley's long silence began to unravel. The storm that came to Nickel Valley on the 14th of April was not like any storm before it. The air, thick with the scent of metal, trembled even before the first rumble of thunder. Cattle grew uneasy, stamping and tossing their heads, their eyes rolling white. The wind didn't blow, it circled as if searching for something lost. Amos Lapp stood at the doorway, watching the horizon pulse with a faint, unnatural glow. He had seen a lifetime of tempests sweep over the valley, but never one that bled through the clouds like that. By nightfall, The fields lay drowned in shadow, no stars, no moon. Only that steady shimmer in the distance, low and red, flickering like the breath of a furnace. Ruth told Amos to bar the doors. Miriam sat by the window, her face turned toward the barn. She had not spoken since morning. Her small hands clutched the hem of her dress, her lips moving soundlessly. When the first bolt struck, it did not roar. It hissed. The light was crimson, not white, a narrow vein of color that tore through the sky and rooted itself in the heart of the Lapp barn. The house shuddered with the impact. Every lamp went out at once. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of something crackling where the air had been. Then came silence, heavy, absolute. Amos snatched his coat and rushed outside, ignoring Ruth's pleas. The rain had not yet begun to fall, but the ground was wet beneath his boots, as though the earth itself had been sweating. The barn stood untouched. No fire, no smoke, not even the scent of burning. Yet the air around it pulsed, faintly red, like a heartbeat trapped behind the walls. He called Miriam's name once, though he didn't know why. She was still in the house, wasn't she? The wind did not carry his voice. It swallowed it whole. He stepped closer. The door was half open, though he remembered bolting it that afternoon. A single rope hung loose from the latch, twisting slowly, as if something had passed through and forgotten to close it behind. Inside, the animals were quiet, too quiet. Not asleep, not restless, simply still, their breath shallow, eyes reflecting the faint red shimmer that bled through the cracks of the boards. Amos whispered a prayer and reached for the nearest lantern, but before he could strike the flint, he saw it. A mark, seared into the floorboards, 3 thin lines cutting through a circle, blackened as if burned into the wood from beneath. He crouched to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed the edge, the air around him shifted. A low vibration passed through the ground, neither sound nor movement. Something felt rather than heard. The horses stirred. One of them exhaled sharply, its breath clouding in the cold. Then the light flickered again, once, twice, and vanished. Ruth's voice broke through the darkness, calling his name from the porch. When he turned back toward her, he saw Miriam standing beside her mother, barefoot, her dress soaked as though she'd walked through the rain. But the rain hadn't fallen yet. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, wide and unblinking. He shouted for her to go back inside. She didn't move. She only raised her hand and pointed behind him. Amos turned, heart hammering, but the barn was empty. Only the smell of wet hay and iron filled the air. The mark on the floor was gone. When he looked back to the house, Miriam was no longer by the door. Ruth stood alone, her face pale, her hands trembling against the frame. A gust of wind swept through the yard then, carrying with it the first drops of rain, thick, warm, and smelling faintly of ash. By morning, the storm had passed. The barn was standing, untouched, its doors wide open as if in invitation. Inside, every animal was alive, unharmed, yet the air held a taste that did not belong to earth or rain. And Miriam Lapp, found sitting in the doorway at dawn, stared into the emptiness with eyes too dry to cry. She would not speak again. In the weeks that followed the storm, the Lapp household fell into a strange and dreadful rhythm. The days stretched long and silent, and the nights pressed close with a kind of listening stillness, as if the very air awaited a sound that never came. Miriam spoke no word, not even in her sleep. She moved through the house like a shadow misplaced, her eyes fixed on something invisible just beyond the edge of the room. Her mother prayed aloud each evening, but her voice trembled more with each passing night. At first, Amos believed it was shock. He told the elders she had been frightened by the lightning, that children see the world in ways reason cannot mend. The elders nodded and said time would heal, yet time did not touch her. A week passed, then 2, and Miriam remained trapped within herself, lips pale, eyes wide, as though she were still witnessing something none of them could see. The animals refused to enter the barn after dark. Horses snorted and pulled away from their stalls. Chickens scattered to the corners of the yard. And even the family dog, a loyal creature that had never left Amos's side, began sleeping beneath the porch, whining softly when the wind turned east. Amos checked every beam and board, searching for signs of rot or infestation, but found nothing amiss. Still, He could not shake the feeling that the building itself was holding its breath. On the 12th night after the storm, Ruth found her daughter sitting on the floor of her room, drawing with a piece of charcoal she must have taken from the hearth. The walls were covered in black marks, circles cut by 3 long lines, drawn over and over until her fingers were gray with soot. When Ruth asked what she was doing, Miriam turned her head slowly, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. Only her eyes moved, shifting toward the window that faced the barn. The following morning, a doctor was summoned from a nearby town, a man known to the Amish for his discretion. He examined the child, found no fever, no injury, no physical cause for her muteness. "It's as if her voice has forgotten the way back," he said quietly. When Amos offered to pay him for his silence, the doctor refused. "You have my word," he said, but his eyes lingered too long on the barn before he left. That evening, Ruth burned every drawing from the walls, scrubbing the soot from her daughter's hands until her own palms bled. Yet by dawn, the marks had returned, this time carved into the wooden floor, as though etched from beneath. No one spoke of it. No one dared. The elders began visiting under the pretense of prayer. They spoke softly in their dialect, words half buried in scripture, phrases Amos did not remember from the Bible. When he asked what they meant, they told him to keep faith and maintain silence. "The valley remembers," one of them said before leaving, his eyes distant, "and remembrance is not always mercy." At night, Ruth began to dream of whispers, voices murmuring from inside the barn, voices that sounded like her daughter's, multiplied and echoing. She would wake to find the window open and the faint scent of hay drifting into the room. Sometimes she thought she saw a flicker of red light far out in the fields, a pulse that faded when she blinked. Amos stopped going to the barn after sunset. He told himself it was superstition, but he could not bring himself to cross the threshold. The air inside felt wrong, too heavy, too warm. Once, he thought he heard a slow creaking from the rafters, followed by the faint shuffle of something moving above him. When he looked up, nothing was there. Miriam grew thinner. She ate little, slept less, and spent her hours staring through the glass toward the field where the lightning had struck. Sometimes her lips moved as though repeating a prayer, but no sound followed. When Ruth asked her what she saw, she finally lifted her gaze. Her voice emerged, faint, broken, but clear enough to freeze the air around her. "It's waiting," she said, "and it knows our names." The doctor who examined Miriam did not return to Nickel Valley, yet something he had seen there seemed to follow him. Weeks later, he sent a small package by courier, wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax. Inside was a note written in hurried pen. "This was among your belongings. You should not keep it." Beneath the paper lay a book, old, bound in blackened leather, its cover cracked with age and moisture. The title was pressed faintly into the surface in faded German script, Das schweigende Fleisch, the silent flesh. Amos did not remember ever owning such a thing, yet Ruth insisted she had seen it before, though she could not say when. "There had been a time," she whispered, "when the elders spoke of books brought over from the old country, texts not meant for reading, but for keeping, hidden and unspoken, artifacts of a faith that had turned its face away from God." Amos told her it was nonsense. Still, he hid the book in a locked chest in the attic, far from their daughter's reach, but the house seemed aware of its presence. The air thickened. The floorboards creaked in places they had never creaked before. Miriam's silence deepened, her eyes dull but watching, always fixed on the ceiling above her, as though she knew where the book was kept. One night, Ruth woke to the sound of whispering. It came from above, faint and rhythmic, words pressed through the wood in a tongue she could not understand. She rose, lantern trembling in her hand, and climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The air there was stifling, dry and warm, as though something had been breathing too long in a closed room. The chest stood open. The book lay on the floor, its pages fanned out like wings. When she reached for it, a sudden gust extinguished her flame. She heard movement, a small, soft shifting, and when she relit the lantern, Miriam was standing behind her, barefoot. Her hands were covered in dust. "It wanted air," the child said in a voice that was not quite her own. The following morning, Amos found Ruth pale and shaking. the book wrapped again in cloth, her lips pressed tight as if holding back a scream. She begged him to burn it, but Amos refused. Burning scripture, however blasphemous, was sin. He buried it instead, deep beneath the barn, under a slab of wood where the earth was soft. That evening, the animals refused to enter again. One of the cows broke its tether and ran until it vanished into the trees. Amos cursed himself for his weakness. Yet when he returned to the house, he saw dirt on the hem of Miriam's dress. Her fingers were streaked with black soil, and beneath her nails, something dark pulsed faintly, like the thin beat of a hidden vein. 2 nights later, the whispering returned, this time louder, echoing through the walls. Ruth prayed aloud, clutching the Bible until her knuckles turned white. Then, silence. A stillness so complete that the ticking of the clock seemed like a hammer against the air. When Amos rose to check the barn, he found the ground disturbed. The place where he had buried the book was no longer flat. The soil was cracked open, as if something beneath had pressed upward during the night. He did not speak of it. Neither did Ruth. Words had begun to feel dangerous. Even the elders grew uneasy, visiting less often, avoiding the Lapp farm entirely. They said nothing, yet their faces carried the weight of memory, of stories buried deeper than Amos's shovel could reach. Days passed without sunlight. The sky hung low and gray, as though the valley had fallen under a shadow that refused to move. In that dim light, Miriam sat by the window, humming a tune that had no melody. When her mother asked where she had learned it, she turned her head slowly, her pupils wide and dark. "It was in the pages," she whispered. "It said the silence has a name." The first animal disappeared 3 nights after the whispering began. A ewe from the neighboring farm, gone without a trace. Its owner, an elderly Amish man named Jonas Byler, searched the pastures until dawn. He found no tracks, no broken fences, no signs of struggle, only a patch of grass flattened in a near-perfect circle. He told Amos that perhaps a wild dog had come through the valley, though his voice carried no conviction. The Amish spoke rarely of the unnatural, but they feared it all the same. When the second sheep vanished, the circle appeared again, this time in Amos's own field, near the edge where the soil turned dark and the trees leaned too close. The grass within it was blackened, though not burned, and the air around it smelled faintly of copper. Amos refused to let Ruth see it. He cut the section out with a scythe and buried it deep, but the earth rejected it. By morning, the soil had pushed the grass back up, as if the valley refused to keep what he had given it. Then came the 3rd night. The wind rose, sharp and strange, carrying a low hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The livestock cried out, their sounds sharp with panic, and then fell silent. When Amos reached the barn, the door was wide open, though the latch was unbroken. Inside, one of the sheep lay in the center of the floor, perfectly still. Its eyes were gone, its tongue was missing, its legs were bound together with rough twine, knotted in a pattern that Amos had never seen before, but somehow recognized from the margins of the forbidden book. Ruth found him kneeling there, trembling, the air thick with the smell of blood and hay. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Miriam stood behind her mother, watching the carcass. There was no fear in her face, only recognition. She stepped forward, reaching out a small hand to touch the animal's wool, and whispered, "It took what it gave." Amos struck her hand away. For the first time, his daughter's expression changed, not to pain, but to something colder, almost pitying. The elders arrived at dawn, their buggies silent against the frozen ground. They examined the animal, muttering prayers that sounded older than the valley itself. One of them, a tall man with a white beard, drew Amos aside. "It has begun again," he said, voice low, eyes fixed on the distant trees. "We warned your father's father never to till this soil." "The ground remembers," Amos demanded to know what he meant, but the man only looked toward the barn and whispered, "You've buried something that was not meant to rest." The elders ordered the carcass to be burned outside the boundary of the farm. They formed a circle, reciting words in German too old for translation. The flames burned higher than seemed possible, and as the smoke rose, it turned the color of rust. The wind shifted, blowing the stench toward the house. Ruth covered Miriam's eyes, but the girl whispered beneath her breath, lips moving to the rhythm of the chanting. That night, the valley was silent, Even the crickets seemed to have fled. Amos tried to pray, but every word felt hollow. When he finally drifted into uneasy sleep, he dreamt of the barn again, of the mark burned into its floor, now glowing faintly, pulsing with light from beneath the earth. He woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Outside, under the pale moonlight, Miriam was standing barefoot in the field, facing the barn. Her dress clung to her in the damp air. At her feet lay a pile of wool, clean, white, untouched by blood. She turned toward her father, her expression blank. "It took the eyes," she said softly, "so it wouldn't have to see what's coming." Amos carried her inside without a word. When he returned to the window, the wool was gone. Only the circle in the grass remained, glistening faintly in the moonlight, as if the ground itself had begun to breathe. The Sunday following the burning of the carcass arrived under a dim and swollen sky. The air hung heavy with the scent of smoke and damp earth, and though the valley should have been alive with the sound of bells and voices, Nickel Valley felt subdued, hesitant, as if waiting for permission to breathe. The Amish do not speak of fear, yet that morning every step toward the meeting house carried the weight of something unspoken. The bishop, Eli Zook, was a man known for his gravity. His sermons were measured, his faith unwavering, his gaze firm enough to settle even the most restless spirit. But that morning, when he entered the wooden meeting house, his eyes did not meet the congregation's. He looked thinner, pale, as though he had been fasting. He greeted no one, merely nodded and began the service without song. The benches creaked softly as the families bowed their heads. The sermon started as all sermons did, with a passage from Proverbs about humility and obedience. His voice was steady, but beneath it there was something hollow, as if the words had lost their roots. Halfway through the reading, he stopped. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like the pause of someone listening rather than speaking. Then, slowly, his hand began to tremble. Eli closed the Bible and stared at the window beside the pulpit. His lips parted slightly, though no sound came. His eyes seemed fixed on something beyond the glass, something no one else could see. A faint murmur rippled through the room, but no one dared move. Ruth gripped Miriam's hand tightly, but the girl did not flinch. Her eyes were wide and bright, reflecting the same strange stillness that had overtaken the bishop. When Eli finally spoke, his voice had changed. The calm rhythm of Scripture was gone. What came out instead was low, strained, almost childlike. "He watches," he whispered. "Even when you turn away, he does not." His hand lifted, pointing toward the distant fields beyond the window. The ground beneath us remembers every word, every silence. A collective unease passed through the congregation. Some whispered that he was unwell, that the devil was testing their faith. Others bowed their heads, unwilling to see what might be looking back through the glass. Eli's face had grown ashen. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. He stepped down from the pulpit, moving slowly, as though pulled by an unseen hand. "The circle opens," he murmured, almost to himself, "and it will not close again." Then he collapsed. The Bible struck the floor, its pages fanning open to a passage none dared read aloud. Two men rushed to lift him, but Eli's eyes were open, glassy, unfocused. He was breathing, yet something in him seemed already gone. Amos helped carry him to the adjoining room, where they laid him upon a cot. For hours he lay unmoving, until at last, near dusk, he rose and left without a word. By morning, he was gone. His house stood empty, the doors open, his bed neatly made. Only a single object remained upon his table, an old photograph, sepia-toned and brittle with age. It showed a gathering of Amish men standing before a barn that no longer existed, their faces solemn, their eyes directed toward the camera, except for one. Behind them, in the shadowed doorway of the barn, a figure stood, tall, narrow, indistinct, as though it had been caught halfway between presence and absence. Its shape blurred the edges of the photo, bending the light around it. The elders said little. They sealed the meeting house for a week, claiming it was to honor the missing bishop. But those who lived near his home swore they heard footsteps in the field that night, measured, dragging, circling the place where his house had stood. And when the sun rose, a new mark had appeared in the dirt beside the path, a circle crossed by 3 vertical lines, carved deep into the soil, filled with something dark that did not dry with the morning light. 20 years passed before anyone spoke the bishop's name aloud again. By then, Nickel Valley had swallowed its own history. The land had changed hands, barns rebuilt, graves added quietly to the earth without markers. Yet there remained a sense of something unfinished, something folded beneath the years, like rot beneath snow. It was in that forgotten hush that Eli Yoder returned. He had been a boy when the red lightning struck, a distant cousin to Amos Lapp, raised in the same plain traditions, but unlike the others, Eli had left the community years later, shunned, they said, for questioning scripture. He lived in the world beyond the valley, a world of noise and metal, yet the silence of his childhood had followed him. In his old age, dying of something slow and incurable, he sought out a man who collected stories of the unexplainable. His voice was weak, his eyes sunken, but he insisted his tale be recorded. "You must understand," he said. "We called it faith, but it was a bargain." Eli spoke of a winter in 1974 when disease swept through Nickel Valley. Livestock died first, then infants, then the old. The bishop at the time had declared it a punishment from God, but in private, the elders turned to older knowledge, things carried from the old world, whispered in dialects too archaic for the English tongue. They gathered in the Lapp barn, newly built on the ruins of an older one. There, they performed what Eli called the binding prayer. It wasn't prayer, he said. Not really. They marked the ground, just as it's marked now, the 3 lines through the circle. They spoke words from the book your people found later, the one that shouldn't exist. They called on something to protect the valley from the sickness, and it came. When asked what it was, Eli's voice broke. We never saw its shape, only its shadow. It moved between us like a second breath. The plague ended within a week, but so did the light in the valley. After that, the animals grew nervous, and some children were born without crying. The elders said it was the price. He spoke of nights when he'd hear scratching beneath the floors of the meeting house, as though something clawed at the wood from underneath. The bishop would descend to the cellar to pray, returning pale and trembling. Once, Eli followed him in secret and saw the thing that had been buried there, a box of blackened wood, humming faintly, bound in rope and sealed with scripture written backward. The bishop told me never to speak of it, Eli continued. He said silence was the covenant. If we kept quiet, it would sleep. If we named it, it would remember its hunger. Years later, when the red lightning struck, Eli knew the silence had been broken. It woke, he whispered. The girl saw it because she was chosen. The innocent always sees first. The rest of us, he coughed, his breath rattling. The rest of us hear it, just before it takes us. He claimed that after the bishop vanished, the elders sealed the cellar beneath the meeting house and left the key buried under the altar. The book that Amos found was not the only one. There were others, written by hands long dead, all containing the same passage, a warning in Old High German that translated roughly to, "The flesh must not speak its name, or it will learn to speak ours." When Eli finished his story, he asked the man recording it to destroy the tape, but the collector kept it, transcribing every word. Weeks later, when he returned to verify details, Eli was gone. The nursing home claimed he had passed quietly in his sleep. The tape ends with a faint sound, a scraping, distant at first, then louder, as though someone, or something, were dragging a heavy object across a wooden floor. Then silence. The label on the tape reads only, Nickel Valley Confession, 1997. Do not play after midnight. The discovery of Ruth Lapp's diary came by accident. In 2002, when a restoration crew was sent to stabilize what remained of the Lapp farmhouse, a worker dislodged a floorboard in the upstairs room. Beneath it, wrapped in a decayed piece of linen, lay a small book of coarse paper, the cover darkened by moisture and time. Its pages were cramped with tight handwriting, every line written as though the writer feared she might run out of time before finishing her thought. The entries spanned only 6 months, the months following the storm. The first pages spoke of confusion, of Miriam's silence, of Amos's exhaustion. Ruth wrote of the sleepless nights when the house seemed to breathe, when she awoke to find the door unlatched, though Amos swore he had locked it. She wrote of hearing her daughter whispering in her sleep, not words, but sounds that felt deliberate, almost practiced. It is as if she is learning to speak again, one entry read, but not as my child. As the weeks passed, the entries grew more frantic. The air in the barn has changed, she wrote. When Amos opens the doors, it rushes out like a sigh. The hay smells wrong, sweet and sour at once. He says it's mold. I know better. Something else breathes there. There were long gaps between the entries, followed by sudden bursts of writing. In one, Ruth described waking to the sound of footsteps in the attic, though she knew Amos slept beside her. She went to investigate and found Miriam sitting at the top of the stairs, her nightdress streaked with dust, her eyes wide and unblinking. She said it told her the story of the valley, Ruth wrote. It said there was no God here before us, only the one beneath the field, the one we made promises to. In another passage, Ruth mentioned that Amos had started spending his nights outside, watching the barn from the porch. He said the animals were uneasy again, that something had disturbed the soil behind the building. I think he hears it too, she wrote, but he won't admit it. He is afraid to name it. He knows what happens when you give a thing its name. The second to last entry was nearly illegible. The ink had run, and the words were pressed deep into the paper as if written in panic. Only fragments could be deciphered. Light from the floorboards, whisper through the wall, the circle opening. Then, the final page. The writing was steady, almost calm, the penmanship precise. It read, Miriam has begun to speak again. Her voice is not her own. It speaks of hunger and memory and debt. It says the silence was only sleeping. Amos is gone to the barn. I cannot stop him. The light is coming from beneath the earth again, red and wet like a wound. It says it is not done with us. It says it will remember the ones who listen. Below that line, there was a smudge that might have been blood, or perhaps only ink spilled by a trembling hand. Beneath it, written in smaller letters, were the last words Ruth ever recorded. It wants to be remembered, even if that means through us. The rest of the diary was blank. Not even dust had gathered on those final pages, as if the paper itself refused to hold anything more. When the crew handed it over to local authorities, the pages began to darken within days, turning the color of dried soil. A week later, the book was gone, reportedly lost during transfer to an archive. Only photocopies of the first 4 entries survived. The final page was never reproduced. Those who claimed to have read it in full said the handwriting on the last line had changed, taller, uneven, the letters stretching beyond the margin, as though the hand that wrote them had forgotten how to stop. By the spring of 2003, the Lapp property had been abandoned for years. The house stood hollow, the paint stripped by rain, the windows blank with dust. The barn, though still upright, seemed to lean against the horizon, its wood swollen and gray, its roof sinking inward as though the sky itself had grown heavier above it. Travelers who passed through Nickel Valley claimed the land had gone quiet, not the peace of solitude, but the stillness of a wound that refuses to heal. When the second storm came, it was almost identical to the one 6 years before. The same metallic taste in the air, the same tremor beneath the ground. Some of the older farmers remembered the red lightning, but none spoke of it aloud. They closed their shutters and prayed the wind would pass them by. It struck just after midnight. The lightning fell without sound this time, a single flash that split the valley open. For a moment, the entire field glowed as though illuminated from within. Then everything went dark again. When morning came, the barn was gone. Not collapsed, not burned, gone. The place where it had stood was nothing but scorched earth, a perfect circle of soil blackened and cracked, steaming faintly though no fire had touched it. The animals' troughs remained, their contents untouched, the ropes that had once held the doors swinging loosely from their beams. There was no debris, no foundation, not even nails left behind. Only the smell, heavy, iron-sweet, impossible to describe without invoking blood. The county inspector, a man from Lancaster with no patience for superstition, was the first to arrive. He surveyed the land, took measurements, found nothing. It's subsidence, he said. The earth gave way. Happens sometimes. Yet the soil beneath the circle was solid, dense clay, unmoved for centuries. His boots left no prints there, though the ground was soft. By evening, word had spread across the valley. A few families came to see for themselves, crossing themselves despite the faith that forbade such gestures. One man swore he heard a low hum rising from the dirt, like something breathing beneath the surface. Another saw movement at the far edge of the field, a shimmer of heat where there was no warmth, a flicker that vanished when he blinked. 2 weeks later, a Mennonite farmer named Daniel Cray purchased the property. He said he did not believe in curses, only in opportunity, but he refused to live in the house. He kept his livestock far from the circle and hired no local workers, bringing in men from outside the valley. Within months, the fences began to sag, the crops withered in uneven patterns, and tools left overnight in the field were found rusted by morning. Cray told no one what he saw the night he decided to leave. His wife found him at dawn, sitting on the porch, his hair streaked white. All he could say was that he'd looked out toward the field and seen figures moving in the dark, figures that walked in silence, shoulder to shoulder, until they reached the center of the circle. When he turned away, they were gone. When he looked again, the circle was deeper, as if the earth had inhaled. He sold the property within the week. No one has lived there since. Yet even now, on the nights when the wind turns east and the clouds gather low, travelers on the county road claim to see a faint red glow pulsing at the center of the field. Some say it rises and falls like breath. Others say it flickers in the shape of a roof, the ghost of a barn that still stands in the place where the valley remembers. And on certain mornings, when the fog hangs low enough, the impression of footsteps can be found leading toward the circle, small, bare, perfectly formed, and stopping just at the edge, as though someone stood there waiting to be invited back inside. In 2019, at an estate auction outside of Reading, Pennsylvania, a man named Caleb Hartman purchased a box of old photographs for $20. Most were unremarkable: wedding portraits, farmland scenes, sepia faces of strangers long dead. But among them, one photograph stood apart. It showed a little girl standing before a barn, her hands folded neatly, her expression solemn. The back of the photograph bore a faint inscription in pencil: Miriam Lapp, Nickel Valley, 1997. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, no different from countless other Amish portraits, rigid, silent, resigned to stillness. But under closer light, something in the image felt wrong. The barn behind her appeared too dark, as if the shadows within it were thicker than the rest of the photograph allowed. The boards blurred near the doorway, their edges dissolving into something that was not quite wood, not quite air. Caleb assumed it was damage from time or moisture, until he tilted it toward the lamp. In the glass of the frame, just behind the reflection of Miriam's small figure, another form appeared, faint, almost invisible, a tall shape, narrow, indistinct. Its outline seemed to bend, warping the light as though it refused to be captured. The more he stared, the clearer it became, a figure standing behind her, half hidden in the barn's shadow. Caleb showed the image to a photography expert, who confirmed the paper stock dated to the 1990s, but the emulsion was unusual. It reacts to light differently, he said, almost like it's still developing. He advised Caleb to keep it away from heat or direct illumination. That night, unable to resist, Caleb left the photograph under a desk lamp for several hours. By morning, the image had changed. The figure behind the girl had moved closer. Its outline, once vague, now seemed to lean forward, as though emerging from the barn's threshold. The girl's expression, too, was different. Her eyes no longer fixed on the camera, but slightly to the side, towards something unseen. The shadow behind her appeared darker, textured now, as if breathing. Caleb contacted the auction house, but the seller's records led nowhere. The estate had belonged to a retired archivist from Harrisburg who died the previous year. Among his papers was a single note referencing Nickel Valley, Lapp family, lost negatives. No one could locate the negatives or confirm who had taken the photograph. A month later, Caleb began receiving calls from a blocked number. Each time he answered, there was only silence on the line, a silence thick and rhythmic, as if recorded from inside a hollow space. One night, he played the photograph under a flashlight and recorded the sound of static rising through the speakers of his phone. When he replayed it, beneath the distortion, a child's voice whispered a single word: "Remember." The photograph began to change again. The barn's roof sagged in the image, its edges curling as if collapsing inward. The girl's features blurred, and new lines appeared across the surface, not scratches, but marks forming the same symbol found burned into the lap barn decades before, a circle cut by 3 vertical lines. When Caleb tried to scan the image, every digital copy returned corrupted. The file names changed on their own. Each one labeled it, Still Listens, JPG. In late autumn, Caleb vanished from his apartment. His neighbors reported hearing footsteps pacing through the night, followed by the faint smell of hay and smoke. When police entered the apartment, they found no sign of struggle, only the photograph lying on the floor, the glass shattered, the paper scorched around the edges. The girl was gone from the image. In her place, the barn door stood open, black and endless, swallowing the frame. Today, the photograph's whereabouts remain unknown. Some claim it was confiscated by collectors of paranormal relics, others that it resurfaced briefly online before being deleted within hours. But a few who claim to have seen it describe a faint reflection in its surface, something behind the viewer, tall and still, waiting to be remembered. They say if you stare long enough, you begin to see a child's eyes appear at the edge of the glass, eyes that do not blink, eyes that have been watching all along.